Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Tom Pickerell, and I'm the Executive Director of the Global Tuna Alliance. This is the latest in a suite of webinars coordinated by the Global Tuna Alliance to support signatories in meeting the Tuna 2020 Traceability Declaration. Today's webinar is on human rights at sea and will be presented by David Hammond, founder and CEO of the independent human rights charitable NGO, Human Rights at Sea, and Dr. Jessica Sparks of the University of Nottingham Rights Lab. The webinar will provide background to the organisation and how its work over the past 7 years in the fisheries sector and more widely can support companies make progress on the social responsibility commitment, and to hear about the next steps following on from their recent report, Fishery Observer Deaths at Sea, Human Rights and the Roles and Responsibilities of Fishery Organisations, and which actually includes 10 recommendations. And finally, you're going to get to hear about an ongoing Fisheries Observer survey. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available via the GTA YouTube channel and the GTA website. If I could ask you to please keep your microphones on mute during the webinar to avoid any feedback issues and background noise, it would be much appreciated. We do want to hear from you. There will be plenty of time at the end for questions. But if you do want to use the chat box during the talk, please do that. I'll be keeping an eye on it and I can sort the questions out at the end. And for those of you who have just joined us while I was giving the introduction, welcome. And I'm absolutely delighted to introduce David Hammond and Dr. Jessica Sparks.
Well, Tom, I believe that's my intro there. So firstly, thank you very much indeed for the kind invitation. And I hope that everybody who's listening in is safe and well, certainly in this time of pandemic. I'm David Hammond. I'm the founder and the CEO of Human Rights at Sea. And as Tom has laid out, this is an opportunity to provide the Global Tuna Alliance with an introduction to human rights at sea. We are a UK registered charitable NGO established in 2014, though the concept started in 2013. And I'm just going to take a short time to give you a bit of background before I share my screen and really take you through the pathway to our current work, which is really focused on tuna fisheries and CSR chains, but particularly highlighting fisheries observers and the issues of the safety, health and well-being at sea, particularly with recent deaths that have been publicly reported. So human rights at sea would seem a natural subject to have been out in the international community for some time. The background to the setting up of the actual civil society platform was that whilst I was practicing counsel in London, I was asked by one of my clients what the future was for human rights out at sea. And I did what most people do. I typed those 4 words, human rights at sea, into Google, and I looked for civil society platforms and structures explicitly talking about the human rights side, and not just labour rights, the conservation piece, environmental rights, but specifically human rights. And when I say human rights, we refer to the baseline document of the 1948 Universal Declaration and those 30 articles of fundamental human rights. We also consider in international law that labour rights are a subset of the wider human rights picture. And so at that time in 2013, we discovered remarkably that there was no civil society platform explicitly talking about human rights at sea, but many organisations were talking about the labour rights, environmental rights, and touching on the human rights aspect. And that is the genesis for the NGO. Today, we are expanding. We have a significant global reach in terms of the work that we do. And I'm going to take you through that. It's obviously a huge subject. It's been taken 7 years to build. So I'm really going to praise it as much as I'm able to. We've also got Dr. Jessica Sparks from the University of Nottingham, the Rights Lab, internationally renowned structure and organisation dealing with slavery, trafficking, and a professional organisation that we're formally partnered with. And Jess will cover the issues of the Fisheries Observer Survey that is now underway in the Western and Central Pacific. So what I'm going to do now, if the technology works, is share my screen, so bear with me. And while I'm sharing that screen, as Tom says, please bring forward any questions that you have, and we will be delighted to answer them. If we can't answer them, we will endeavour to get back to you. And if we don't know the answer, we will say that. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity. This slide is key to the fundamental structure of our organisation. And our founding principle and everything that we work to is that human rights apply at sea as they do on land. So in a nutshell, the rights that you, wherever you're sat in the world at this time, and myself, Jess, Tom, etc., are entitled to under the Universal Declaration, we see no reason why they should not apply at sea. And we are really focused on raising the global awareness alongside other organisations and partners. We don't seek to be sort of prima et pares for the subject matter, but to work collectively to highlight abuses at sea and deliver social change through both legal and policy development. Our call to action is very straightforward. It's there on the screen, and it is that application of human rights throughout the entire maritime environment at all times and without exception. We also have our mission, of course, all organisations do, self-explanatory again on the screen, and it's really looking at raising the issue of human rights throughout what we term the entire maritime environment, and that is the entire supply chains. It's from the low water mark out through the littoral, coastal regions and out into the deep water oceans. And our vision is quite simple: to end human rights abuse throughout that maritime environment. We work to a four-pillar approach with 4 work verticals. You will notice that there are work verticals missing, such as the cruise line industry and offshore oil and gas. But seafarers, global seafarers, the issues at the moment that we know about with the crew change crisis and the problems with the supply chain. Fishers, global fishers, is our second work vertical. Migrants and refugees, particularly focusing in the Mediterranean, but also the Andaman Sea, and keeping abreast of that issue and working with our partners, our NGO partners, as well as states and international organisations. And then 4th work vertical, looking at developing business and human rights, tools, policies, etc., not just for states and civil society, but for companies as well, within the maritime environment. And of course, there are other organisations doing that, and again, we seek to work with them. We work to 6 sustainable development goals. I'm sure you're familiar with those, and we really believe that our work reflects across those 6 areas of the SDGs. I just want to highlight for those of you who are very fisheries focused, but the reality of the maritime environment, that first work vertical is these statistics in relation to the global shipping industry. And of course, the supply chains between shipping and the fishing communities overlap as well. But the figures there speak for themselves. And the headline takeaway is that by 2030, the world population is going to be assessed at around about 8.5 billion. So what? There are going to be more people moving by sea. There's going to be greater call on resources that we all know. And there is a ecosystem there that is ripe for human rights abuses at sea. For all those in the global fishing industry, this is just a snapshot of statistics that we work to, but we know that there is a significant pooling of people who are potentially subject to human rights abuses out in the maritime environment. And then in terms of our 3rd vertical, just to frame it for you in the context of our organisation, there is a significant migrant movement occurring at this time, well reported, and the Maersk Etienne case, for example, of the record of up to 38 days with migrants held on board without states stepping forward and taking responsibility under international law, is very significant and is significant to our work. So again, for those people who don't know about our organisation, I just wanted to share our big picture ongoing work. Strategically, we have developed and drafted the Geneva Declaration on Human Rights at Sea. It's not new law, it is a re-establishment of existing law, but The reason it's been drafted and written is that under the UN Convention Law of the Sea, for example, 1982, you will not find the term human rights embedded in that convention. You will not find human rights explicitly spoken about. And sorry, just to step back, in UNCLOS, it's not explicitly stated, but it is embedded through articles that allow you to import universal declaration and international conventions on human rights, but it's not explicit. Neither is it explicit in the likes of the Maritime Labour Convention, the sister really to ILO 188. So we've drafted the Geneva Declaration. We are also working and have just recently issued and established a new platform looking at arbitration, established arbitration around the world for, say, banking and shipping, but as a means and route to effective remedy for victims of human rights abuses at sea. And there is an entire platform now available for that. And we have also been working on research, advocacy, investigation and lobbying, which is how we do our business. And I will cover some of those topics again, just as a taster. And all of this material is free. We give it away free. It's for you to use within your organizations, but also to challenge us on. And we do appreciate you providing feedback. So successes and delivery. A lot of people on this call will be for profit, will be commercial entities looking for investments that provide delivery and success. We've established the International Maritime Human Rights Conference, introducing human rights within the maritime space, both in 2016 and 2018. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, it couldn't be run this year. We've been a member of the Global Compact since 2015 and submitted numerous reports into the Secretary General in New York. Again, those are available to download. We established the first global missing seafarers and fishers reporting program. Again, another platform that you can track into and gain access from our main platform website. And we seek to provide a database when resources allow us to be updated and start to gain a scale of missing seafarers and fishers. We're literally just scratching the surface simply because of the numbers that come through. In terms of us actually having effect, in 2013, as I outlined, human rights at sea really wasn't discussed at any level on the global web. I'm sure it was discussed within boardrooms, but we have seen a real change in the narrative and the lexicon of human rights at sea being used throughout the supply chain. Some notable points were that last year in February, India ran as the first state to run a specific conference on human rights at sea. And the so what from that is, India is one of the founding members of the International Maritime Organization, and it has a significant seafaring and fishing community. So a state has taken a focus on it. Last year in October, we issued a baseline study on human rights and application of human rights in Taiwan's fishing industry. That was officially recognized by the Taiwanese government and by the fisheries agency with whom we work on a case-by-case basis alongside other organizations. I spoke to you about the Geneva Declaration. It is an original project initiative that we have established. And on that slide there, you can see there are 4 principles. And those are the 4 principles that underpin that document, which we aim to finish this year and submit into the Human Rights Council. The arbitration, again, is ongoing. It's also in French. We have partnered with the international law firm Shearman & Sterling with their Paris-based arbitration team. And they are providing all of the background legal analysis and access to the likes of the ICC and other legal entities and big business to run this project, which is a victim-led project where we provide the services pro bono with the aim of establishing an ad hoc international tribunal, so it can be set up anywhere, to arbitrate between an employer and an employee. There will be model clauses for employment contracts to follow, and a series of pieces of work which we will again publish transparently. And the reason we have this platform is that we want to show transparently how we are developing the process. And of course, we encourage people to engage with us on that. This is a simple slide of an example of many of the reports that we do. Again, case studies covering fishing, shipping, migrants, and they again are free to download. We aim to give you these ISBN publications with footnotes, with a lot of background research undertaken, so you don't have to do it, and you can check against the work that we're doing. In the UK-centric approach on the fishery side, we undertook a baseline assessment, which was part of a project that has been halted because of coronavirus, but working with the Fishermen's Mission and again the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab, sponsored by the Fishmongers Company in the UK, for looking at a needs assessment report on the issues of human rights and social welfare across the entire industry. That was supported by the participants that are highlighted there, and again is an ongoing piece of work. Again, we provide this for people to access totally transparently. In terms of our impact, feel free, anybody who's interested, to look at our reports in terms of due diligence against us, or towards us rather, and our governance and our annual reports, again, are all there free to download. Really focusing now on probably why most people are here is in relation to our fisheries work, which is our second work vertical, if you remember back to that pillar approach. We have undertaken business and human rights audits within the UK fishing industry. We have gone on the ground into countries. The middle example is looking about levels of understanding and baselining within fishing communities. We've produced alongside the National Federation of Fisheries Organisations and the Fishermen's Mission in the UK a briefing note about share fishing, and that may be applicable outside of the UK, so again, free to download. We have undertaken, as already highlighted, a baseline example in the Taiwanese fishing community. We've also most recently looked at how sanctions can be a tool to protect human rights at sea. And there's a UK statutory instrument which we've worked with the law firm Holm Fenwick Whelan to produce and provide that as a briefing note. We have produced our own example. There's many examples of publications in terms of the role of the Fisheries Observer, and that really digs into the reality at the front end. So it's really focusing on a personal account as opposed to the standard statements that we hear about what fisheries observers are and what they are not. And then as I start to draw towards handing over to Jess, most of you may be aware or will be aware of the report that we issued on the 1st of July, looking at fisheries observers' deaths at sea as and the human rights angle of that. Of course, we include labour rights in that, but also the roles and responsibilities of fisheries organisations, and just how far are fisheries organisations, those who certify standards, and those within the supply chain, how far should they go in terms of not just their legal responsibilities within their duty of care, but also their moral responsibilities when they are made aware of an issue which relates to human rights abuse, which could be at the extremists of murder at sea through to physical abuse, torture, and torture under the Torture Convention covers both mental and physical torture, deprivation of liberty at sea, access to family, access to legal support. Again, circling back to the Universal Declaration in 1948. That report was probably one of our most, if not the most comprehensive report we've done to date. And we are following on with an equally comprehensive ISBN publication, which is looking at, and forgive the screen because there is a lot of writing, but these slides will be for you to take away. The 10 recommendations that we put forward, which was scrutinized by the likes of the Association for Professional Observers, WWF, and other NGOs who reviewed this work. Those are the first 5. I'll move on to the last recommendations there. But those recommendations are covering certification organizations, the requirements for public-facing policies, collation and reporting mechanisms. I'm just going to switch back, as well as transparency and investigations, engagement with Interpol, who have been working with us and us alongside them in relation to investigations, and the use and access of EMS data, for example. So those 10 recommendations, which were, and I'm just going to switch back to the report image, are embedded in this report, are going to be effectively reviewed, which is what we're doing at the moment. We're about 80% through that report, and we're going to deep dive on each of those 10 recommendations. And the reason we're doing that is that we want to move the narrative and the issue forward, and we want to have provided a strong degree of due diligence into asking what I would say is the so what question to issuing a report with recommendations. What do I mean? Well, so what of those 10 recommendations? What do they mean? What needs to be done? And what considerations need to be taken into account when looking at each of those recommendations? The reason I say that is that it's all well and good for NGOs and civil society organisations to say, hey, there's an issue. Here's what we found, and here are our recommendations. I believe we need to go further and come up with not just recommendations, but solutions, and work collectively with like-minded organisations who want to work through those recommendations. So some of you, if not all of you, may be aware of the ongoing Fisheries Observers Survey in the Western and Central Pacific region. I'd just like to take this opportunity now, before I hand over to Jess for her deeper dive into the lead that the Rights Lab has taken on this, but take the opportunity to thank members of the audience, but also more widely organisations that have stepped up and agreed to push forward this survey, which is covering a plethora of issues, again, which Jess will cover. And that has really been focused with organisations in the Western and Central Pacific region, both at state level, at commercial level, pushing the survey out. And yesterday, a circular was issued by WCPFC in relation to this survey, encouraging dissemination of it to observers. And it is for observers to submit within the survey, and it's non-identifiable. And so I will stop there, and I will stop sharing my screen, and I will pass you over to Jess for picking up on the detail of that survey. Jess, over to you.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Tom, as David said, for the invite today. Following on what David was talking about, I'm Dr. Jess Sparks. I'm the Associate Director of the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab. A brief background on the Rights Lab: we are considered a University of Nottingham beacon of excellence. What this essentially means is that we are a transdisciplinary research group that is not housed within a singular department, but rather we bring faculty from across the university into our research center. The core aims of the Rights Lab: we do have 5 research strands, although these aren't discrete, they all intersect with one another. We have a data and measurement program, a communities and society program, the ecosystems and the environment program, which is the program that I lead, law and policy, and also business, which is primarily focused on supply chains research. Our primary remit is to research all elements of modern slavery as defined by the United Kingdom under the Modern Slavery Act. So this includes everything from the most egregious forms of exploitation to labor exploitation and other facets of exploitation that do not meet the definition of modern slavery, and also understanding the opposite. In the realm that I work, this is primarily around labor issues, so also understanding what decent work looks like. We are problem-oriented, and as I mentioned, we are transdisciplinary. We work with both the global and domestic partners. As David mentioned, I've been working with Human Rights at Sea around fisheries work in the United Kingdom. We also work with governments. We work very closely with the UK Home Office around the Modern Slavery Act, etc. We also work closely with United Nations University and Delta 8.7, which is an anti-slavery / decent work initiative to achieve SDG 8.7. A little bit about the Ecosystems and the Environment Program, which, as I mentioned, is the program that I lead. What we do is we're guided by an overarching question of how is environmental change interconnected with labor, rights, and working conditions. So we use a variety of methodologies, everything from satellite data to qualitative case studies and narratives with workers on the ground to big quantitative data modeling. A couple of our key strategies is that we try to map the synchronous occurrence of environmental degradation and labor exploitation, and we also model the ecological dimensions of precarious work. So as the climate is changing, as the environment is changing, how are working conditions changing, and how do we also maintain norms around decent work as we're facing these global challenges. My background is in marine capture fisheries, which is where I've worked for approximately 6 years now, but our team, we focus on a variety of ecosystems, including agriculture, forestry activities, freshwater, mining, etc. And we also look at how these different sectors intersect. So we know that a lot of what we would identify as precarious workers do transcend and get transferred in between various sectors, so we look at those pathways as well. Moving on to the Fisheries Observer Study, which is what we're here to talk about today. As David set up the background and the reasons behind the initiative, behind the survey. The survey's main objective is that we want to explore the working conditions for fisheries observers, and specifically in the Western and Central Pacific Ocean. We want to do this through a couple of ways. First, we want to establish baseline measures of norms around working conditions. So from some of our preliminary work, it sounded like some entities actually do their own in-house surveys about the working conditions, the labor rights, potentially of observers, but that this is typically not done by third party. And so by Human Rights at Sea and University of Nottingham leading this work, we've now moved to a third-party format, which could enhance results in a couple of different ways. For example, in the past couple of days, I've actually received communication from multiple observers that they were really interested in taking the survey, but they wanted assurances about the anonymity of it and the connections to their employer. So it does seem very palpable that there are concerns from observers about being transparent or disclosing potentially certain conditions when these surveys are administered through employers versus a third party where, again, we can assure some anonymity. So we also want to understand the extent and nature of labor abuses and harassment, and identifying factors that increase the risk of poor working conditions. So something that I've always been very interested in my own work is, what are those tipping points? It's often not the case that we go from good working conditions to immediately poor working conditions. So what are the tipping points that we can identify? So when we start seeing them, when we're operating some surveillance of a system and we start seeing them, we can intervene to prevent the slide into poor working conditions. Our second aim was to develop a self-administered questionnaire that can be re-administered over time. As mentioned before, it seems like there's a real need for this to be sort of from a third party to provide some assurance to fisheries observers, but by acquiring longitudinal data, we can better identify patterns, trends, and changes in working conditions over time, which can help us identify what are some of those tipping points, et cetera. But also it gives us data for monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of regulatory changes and other interventions that might be enacted. It's hard to know what the success of an action is, or if there are unintended consequences if, of course, we don't have something to compare it to. So the hope is that the survey has been designed in a way that it can actually be replicated and or potentially scaled up to go beyond the Western and Central Pacific Ocean. Some details about the survey. Foremost, there are 3 inclusion criteria to participate. One is, of course, that you need to be a fisheries observer in the Central and Western Pacific Ocean. One is that you also need to be 18 years of age or older, which has to do with research ethics, which I will touch on in a moment. And then, of course, you have to provide informed consent that you want to participate in the study and that you are participating voluntarily and that no one is forcing you to take this study. As we mentioned, the sample area is the Western Central Pacific Ocean. We use the definition from the FAO of Fishing Area 71, which I've included on the map here, and is also the same map that we've used in the survey materials so that fishers can identify specifically how we are identifying the Western Central Pacific Ocean. We had a 3-pronged recruitment strategy in terms of how we're actually reaching out to observers to ask if they want to participate in the study. So there's self-circulation, where Human Rights at Sea has phenomenal reach in this community, and so they publish the materials for the survey on their own platforms. We've also relied on a lot of key informant or stakeholder engagement, where we've gone to organizations such as the Association for Professional Observers, PNA, et cetera, who have distributed our survey materials to the observers affiliated with their programs. And lastly, we use snowball sampling, which is just a term wherein we have encouraged observers who have taken the survey to actually forward the materials on to other observers who may meet these criteria that we talked about in terms of inclusion. The survey is completely anonymous. It's done online, which helps us facilitate that anonymity. We do not collect IP addresses. We do not collect names. We collect no identifying information. And actually, we were very, very deliberate, even in what type of demographic questions that we asked. For example, in conversations with stakeholders, we knew that there was some interest in understanding gender dynamics, but upon further investigation, there are just too few individuals who identify as female and as observers in this area at the moment that we felt like if we included that demographic variable, that in relation to other questions on the survey, it might be possible to determine the identity of a respondent. And so we had to make some tough decisions about which demographic questions to include and exclude based on that identity. So we did take this anonymity piece incredibly seriously. It is online through a survey platform of Qualtrics, which we selected because it provides some essential security features for everything from being GDPR compliant, which is a data privacy law that governs the United Kingdom and the European Union in terms of how it stores data, but also in terms of some features that help us identify if anyone is providing fraudulent responses, trying to undermine the integrity of the survey, to preventing repeat submissions of the survey by the same respondent. Survey questions, overall, there are 54 questions, and most of those questions are closed-ended. They are in English at the moment due to sort of the tight time frame and the funding restrictions that we had at the moment. But we did also receive assurance from many of our stakeholders that due to English requirements and many observer programs, that wouldn't completely eliminate or totally bias the sample, although it does, of course, introduce some bias there. Questions begin in the survey. We cover questions about their most recent trip, but then overall we move on to more detailed questions about their experiences as an observer overall. This again went to the point of trying to protect anonymity out of concern that if we ask too many specific questions about their most recent trip, that we would be able to potentially, or someone would be able to potentially identify the participant. And also from what we know about surveying individuals about sensitive topics, that you need to have a balance about very specific, but also more broad, and that those more broad questions about a broader period of time, you're actually more likely to get respondents to disclose sensitive matters if they so choose. And also that by using a couple of the specific questions to set up the survey, it does allow us to ground some of those broader questions about their experiences as well. As I mentioned, most of the questions are closed-ended. Again, that was to try and encourage completion of the survey. Unfortunately, survey fatigue is a very real phenomenon. And with the lack of baseline data that is involved or that exists for observers in this area, we had to balance the need to collect as much data as possible in a one shot, with also trying to balance encouragement to complete and finish the survey. And so as a result, we had several questions, like I said, 54, but they are mostly closed-ended, so it decreases the amount of time to actually complete the survey. We use, since many of the questions are about opinions, attitudes, perceptions of their experiences, etc., we use Likert questions, which is a series of questions that basically is intended to measure some of these more subjective constructs through a multidimensional way. So Likert questions are just a way to operationalize or quantify perceptions of a problem in a more complex and multidimensional way, rather than reducing the complexity down or oversimplifying it to a yes or no answer. Because we know from a research perspective that if we reduce it down to a binary answer, that actually increases bias in your survey responses. Also, the survey was approved and went through an independent ethics review through the University of Nottingham. So that ethics committee was looking, it was comprised of 4 members, and it was looking for a couple different facets in the study. One, were we ensuring that we had informed consent from the observers? The primary concern that was raised at this time, to be transparent, was that we were using stakeholders who may be tied to the employer of the observers, and how would we ensure that those stakeholders wouldn't gatekeep? How would we ensure that those employers or stakeholders also wouldn't send out the materials and essentially coerce observers to responding in a certain way? So we had to go through mechanisms to try and minimize the possibility of that happen. The main strategy was that while we sent materials to be disseminated to our stakeholders, there were additional materials in the survey instrument itself. So if an observer did go to the survey, they would have access to materials that couldn't be altered, that were protected, etc., to make sure that they received the information as we intended them to receive, with very explicit reminders about the voluntary nature of the survey and what that voluntary nature meant, with explicit examples of what was voluntary and what is involuntary. The other, another dimension of the ethics review was that we were required to show that we were providing support and resources to observers in case any questions, particularly if they were disclosing instances of abuse or harassment, that they were provided with support and resources. So we administered information about services offered through APO, the Association for Professional Observers, but also various other resources like Stella Maris or Apostleship of Sea, as well as Seafarers Mission, etc., and resources that they would find in ports. And lastly, the ethics committee also reviewed the survey instrument, because we were, after its design, we were also required to submit that to assess it for its rigor and for the quality of the research design itself. We are currently still collecting data, as David mentioned with the survey link up there. The survey will be opened until October the 16th. So if you know of any observers or have access to those networks, please do circulate our materials. Once the survey has closed, we will report our findings in a variety of ways. We will report essentially descriptive statistics. So, what is the, if 70 observers took the survey, 55 of them reported some type of incident of harassment, etc. We will also be looking at inferential statistics and some of the ways that we have structured our questions. And this was also a reason why we use Likert questions versus just a binary yes/no question. It will allow us to produce, potentially, if we get good enough response, inferential statistics that would help us identify relationships between certain variables. So are there dynamics or characteristics of certain vessels that are more likely to provide better working conditions or worse working conditions, but also trends and patterns in terms of external factors that might be influencing working conditions as well. We hope to be able to do a bit of modeling. Again, it depends on how many responses we actually receive to see if we can develop any probabilities or predictions about what are some factors that are known to predict both good and poor working conditions that will help us pinpoint where we can improve regulations, policies, and perhaps develop other interventions and actions. I keep saying potentially that we can do this because the inferential statistics does depend on the amount of responses we get, how much variance we have in those survey responses. So if all the respondents are coming from Papua New Guinea, for example, or if we have a dispersion throughout the Western Central Pacific Ocean. There are also some limitations, so the survey will not be generalizable due to how we've obtained our sample in a very opportunistic way. But again, this survey was really intended to be a first effort and to help us develop an instrument that could be reused, perhaps refined after this, scaled up, and also to help us generate future hypotheses for where we need to do research and do deeper dives moving forward. And lastly, we will run some statistics on the construction of the survey instrument itself to determine, are we collecting the right variables? Do we have the right questions to measure some of these more subjective social constructs that we're interested in? And these measures will help us determine if this is a useful instrument, as I said, to continue to use and also to scale up to other contexts. So that's my spiel about the survey. Like David, I'm happy to answer any questions at the conclusion. I'm also happy to field questions via email. And if you're interested in some of the programs and research, not only the Fisheries Observer work, but some of the other work that we do at the Rights Lab, I've included our website and also our social media where we often produce policy briefings, examples of our research, etc. And David, I will stop sharing so you can resume.
Jess, thank you very much. And I will just finish off with my last two slides, which I hope that everybody will shortly be able to see. So the next stages for us are really fourfold. Firstly is the publishing within the next 6 weeks of that follow-up independent international report, specifically on the 10 recommendations, the deep dive and the analysis with a SWOT analysis, which will be disclosed from that 1st of July Fisheries Observer report. We will also at the same time and concurrently be working to finalise and publish the Fisheries Observer survey that Jess has comprehensively gone through. That survey closes, as Jess said, on the 16th of October. And then we have got a number of other small documents that we aim to put together for a series of collated submissions to certainly WCPFC for their December meeting, either directly or indirectly, depending on the access we have to the members, and also any applicable UN agencies. And finally, as always, key here is our ongoing support to our partners across the civil society and state community. for our work, which we will do on a collaborative basis. I'd just like to make a couple of final points, if I can, before handing over to Tom and taking any questions in this last period. As you will have seen from what Jess has already said, it's key for us that we do have stakeholder engagement, and we're always looking for new partners. Our processes with Human Rights at Sea and with our partners in the Rights Lab are transparent. They're deliberately transparent. They're also ethical, and we will disclose our processes, our methodology, and also the ethical guidelines that we're working to. We believe that is key to the assurance of our work. So, final slide is just to say thank you very much indeed. We do appreciate the opportunity from GTA to give us this platform, and feel free to reach out and have any direct communications that you need to with Jess and myself. Many thanks indeed. Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you, Jess, as well, for an extremely interesting presentation there. Thank you. Very happy to open it up for any questions you may have. Feel free to just jump in or use the group chat, whatever works for you. While you're having a think about that, I've got a quick question for David. How can businesses best assist you? If there was like a sort of a one thing they could do, what would it be?
Answer our emails, is engage with us without being glib. Human Rights at Sea is non-political. We're non-religious organisation. We pride ourselves on as being independent as we can, with strong governance. And our aim is to be one of the go-to organisations for business to engage with on the issues that we've raised. So, for example, on the Fisheries Observer concerns, if they are within your supply chain, feel free to reach out to us. If we know the answer, we're more than happy to share. If we don't, we will go and find it. And of course, we also work, although we're a charitable organisation, we work on the basis of commissions as well, which we also ask all of those clients to make sure are disclosed and not held behind the corporate veil. So the door is wide open to engage with us, it is the short answer.
Great, thank you. Does anyone want to jump in with a question? Well, I have another one, greedy, like that. Have you engaged with the Sea Alliance? I know Andy Hickman from Tesco's is on the line here, and he chairs that group. I know they're interested in observer safety as well.
Yes, we have communications with the Sea Alliance, and through obviously Seafish, who are operating as the secretariat to the Alliance. Again, we have worked with Andy specifically on the UK Fisheries Baseline Report, which we are grateful for that access there. And we are always open to working with other members within the Alliance as well.
Great. Andy. I'll see if I can unmute you.
Tom,
you've got
Tom,
it.
Sorry about that. I wasn't able to unmute myself. And thank you so much to David and Jess for the presentations. I just had a quick question for both, actually, or different questions for both. The first one was to David about the recommendations to certification bodies. So I just wondered what your plans are in terms of engagement with the MSC. Are there open lines of communication on some of those recommendations, and are you looking to involve any MSC partners in that engagement? That was the question for David. And then I just was thinking, as Jess was presenting about some of the work we do in our supply chains, and I was thinking what would happen if you identify a situation that you think has involved a breach of applicable laws, and would you seek to report that so that it can be investigated and addressed?
Thank you, Andy. To answer your question, firstly, in relation to the 1st of July report and the likes of MSC, ISSF, International Online Foundation. We have a full engagement with them. We have continuing engagement back and forth, including with PNA. And so PNA reached out to engage with us and have also been very forward-leaning in pushing out the Observer survey. In relation to the work that MSC is doing, we note that following the 1st of July report, MSC gave or established a fund for £100,000 for research. We're pleased to see that. We welcomed it. Indeed, we publicly welcome that. We would like to see it go further. And we would say that that should just be the starting point, not just from MSC, but from multiple organisations in that space. The issue of having people with human rights expertise as opposed to just social, labour or environmental, and just focusing on CSR or ESG is, I would say, now becoming in the past. People need to be looking more forward. But to answer your question, yes, we have good open communications with MSC and other organisations. Your second question, was that for Jess or for myself? Forgive me.
I can answer it, David. So actually, because this went through an ethics review and it's scrutinized, and with the anonymity piece, there is no opportunity, there's essentially no opportunity for individuals to disclose enough information that would require us to report something in the survey. And that the few questions where there is like an other option to enter a free response, they are all severely character restricted. And that's because if someone did disclose something under the ethics requirements, that violated some type of law, we would potentially be responsible for reporting that, and then thus would have to breach the anonymity function of the survey. And so there are unfortunately trade-offs with trying to maintain anonymity with the depth of information that you can collect. And unfortunately, that this is an example of one that we had to balance.
Great, thank you. We've had a question from Martin at the Pole Online Foundation, asking, obviously, with regards to the WinFAR 636 case, do you know if there's been any progress on the investigation?
Thank you, Martin. In short, no, we don't have any updates. We are engaged directly with the team at Interpol, based both in Singapore and Lyon. We haven't had any updates, is the short answer. And I am aware that a lot of the issues in relation to the gathering of evidence was related to the inability of teams to get out on the ground in a timely manner. So that's as far as we know, but we are keeping a close eye on it.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions for our two speakers? No? Last chance, anyone? Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks for joining our webinar, and a special thanks to David and Jess for presenting. If you do have any questions that come to you later, or you'd rather ask offline, please feel free to drop me a line. I've got the email addresses of David and Jess, so I can get in contact. And David's already kindly said he'd be very happy to answer anything like that. So please don't hesitate to contact me. So thank you once again. The slides will be put on the GTA website, and as will the recording, and that will be announced on social media. And just like to take the final opportunity to thank both David and Jess for a great presentation, and I hope you all found it as informative as I did. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.